All right, so today we're going to be making a transition from the ancient world to the medieval world, specifically to get us ready to discuss Boethius. Now on the screen, you'll see a map of the Mediterranean region. And what we've been dealing with so far, we have this focus around the Greek-speaking world here, Athens, where we see our action with Plato and Socrates, Macedonia, the region that Aristotle is from. In the aftermath of Aristotle, we enter into what's known as the Hellenistic age or the Hellenistic period. And there's a rather interesting phenomenon that takes place here, because what we find is that during this Hellenistic period, the Greek language, the Greek education, the Greek culture begins to spread. And it comes to really dominate the entire Mediterranean region. But there is also another dominant force that's coming into play, and that is the Roman Empire, centered in Rome, right here at the kneecap of the boot of Italy, but ultimately coming to control this entire Mediterranean region from Hadrian's Wall up here in Britannia, down through the Iberian Peninsula, northern Africa, Egypt, through the Mesopotamian Valley, essentially right up to the gates of India. The Roman Empire becomes the political force of this region. Now, a big part of why the Roman Empire is able to spread so far and be so influential is the fact that not only is it a major powerhouse in terms of its military, but it also has a policy of assimilating. It is going to go into a region, and instead of simply replacing the culture that is there, it assimilates that culture. It brings all of the best elements into it. And so when Rome comes to incorporate the Greek world, it's going to bring with it the Greek language, which spreads throughout the empire. It's going to bring its educational system. It's going to bring some of its concepts of philosophy, some of its concepts of theology. It's going to bring so much of this ancient knowledge and help spread it throughout the Roman Empire. So what we are going to find is that there is this almost shared sense in which the Roman Empire is in many ways Greek. When you look at the Roman society, the Roman culture, you find that so much of it seems to be modeled on or even stolen directly from the Greeks. If you look at their religious pantheon, it's essentially the same, but the names have been changed. Instead of Zeus and Hera, you're going to have Jupiter and Juno, so you have the same basic deities, but in different ways, different names rather. You look at the literature of the time, and again, it seems to be a copy. Virgil's Aeneid is really nothing more than a Roman rewriting of Homer. So we see these types of changes taking place. But there are a couple of areas where the Romans do stand out. One of these is in terms of architecture. And this architecture actually tells us a lot with regards to the political scene in both of these places. Over here we have a Greek temple, and here we have a Roman temple. Now on the surface we see a lot of similarities again. We see the same basic structure, we see the big columns holding it up, but we also should be able to recognize something very different. First of all, when you look at this Greek temple, you'll see that it's very low to the ground, and there are stairs all the way around it so that people can come in and leave at any given time from any given direction. There's no great regulation or control with regards to it. But when you look at the Roman temple is higher off the ground, it's elevated, and there is one central staircase that will take you up into the temple. And that means that the Romans will know who is going in there, when they go in, how long they stay, when they leave. There is control, there is regulation that's taking place. And so I think that this notion of Greek democracy is demonstrated in the concept of the Greek temple, that freedom of movement and exchange. Whereas in the Roman temple, we end up seeing more of that totalitarian, controlling nature that the political machine of Rome becomes. And so that, I think, is an important difference. The other place where we do find a difference is to some degree in philosophy. Now, again, there are a lot of philosophical systems that are simply going to carry over where the Greeks' or ideas are taken over by the Romans. But there is one philosophy that is really uniquely Roman, and that is Stoicism. Stoic philosophy began originally as a religious movement where the universe itself was the divine entity, and every individual, every being within it, had an obligation to adhere to and fulfill a certain role within that society for the well-being of nature itself. But it doesn't take very long before this idea is transformed from a religious view into a political view, whereby the state becomes the most important thing. The state is the ultimate entity, and each one of us are simply cogs in the machine of the state. We still have our duties, we still have our roles to play, but we're doing it not to be part of the universe as a whole, not to fulfill the will of the divine being. We are doing it because we owe everything to the state. Without the state, we don't have any real value or any real existence, any rights, any privileges, anything that we possess only because the state is there to guarantee it. And so we must put the state first before anything or everything else. Now, two of the most prominent Stoics are Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. Seneca, who lived from 2 BC to 65 AD, was a tutor to some of the emperors of Rome, including Nero, and he promoted these ideas of Stoicism. As he got older, we see that he ultimately does fully believe in what he's been preaching, because as he gets older, he sees himself to be a burden to the state. He has got to that age that he feels he cannot contribute anything or play any major part within the state, and so he has to end his life in order to make way for the next generation so that he's not simply wasting and using resources. But what happens is one of the more bizarre episodes in the history of philosophy. Seneca decides that since he is going to end his own life, that he should die as a philosopher like Socrates. And so he fixes hemlock and drinks it down, planning to die like Socrates did. But the mixture wasn't quite right, and so instead of killing him, it paralyzes him. He tries it again. It still isn't right. And so next he says, well, that's not working. Maybe if I slit my wrists. And so he begins to slit his wrists, but he's so old that his blood is clotting before it's able to bleed out, and he's ultimately being spared. His wife tries to convince him that maybe this is a sign from the gods that he still has work to do, but he's very adamant. It is his stoic duty to end his life and no longer be a burden to the state. And so ultimately he does end up in succeeding with killing himself. Marcus Aurelius, who lives from 121 to 180. Marcus Aurelius will become emperor of Rome in 160 and rule for the last 20 years of his life. Marcus Aurelius was trained in this Stoic tradition, and he writes a work called the Meditations. Now, it's interesting to note, I think, and perhaps a little bit perplexing to some people, that when we look at the Meditations, it's actually a very beautiful work of philosophy. It's poetic in nature. It says a lot of beautiful things. But yet, this is the same individual who is responsible for the death and destruction of thousands upon thousands of Christians for no other reason than because they were Christians. How do we equate that? Well, essentially, we see this also as an act of Stoicism. Marcus Aurelius's feelings, his sentiments, don't come into play. His duty is to the state. And so, if this particular group of individuals are deemed unlawful by the state, as emperor, it is his duty to uphold the law, to prosecute those people to the best of his ability. And so, this is another way of perceiving what Stoicism implies. It implies that basic idea that we should put our own thoughts, our own feelings, our wants, our desires aside. We are not important. The state is important. Our duty is important. And so our duty to the state comes before everything else. Now, Rome is, of course, going to take an interesting turn at this point. Throughout much of its early history and up through the time of Marcus Aurelius, the Christian population was being persecuted, was being despised, was being hunted down. They were in hiding. Life was very difficult for them. But yet, within the course of about 200 years, all of that is going to change until Christianity becomes the official faith of the Roman Empire. And here is sort of the timeline of how that happens. We have an emperor in Rome called Elagabalus, and Elagabalus is the leader of what's called the cult of Amasa. Amasa was a sun god, and like many before him and many after him, they recognized the sun god essentially as one of many deities in a great pantheon. A being that Elagabalus, as the head of this cult, is expected to obey, is expected to promote, but one amongst many. What happens, though, is that during the time of Elagabalus, the cult of Amasa begins promoting the idea of monotheism. Mono means one, theism means God. So the idea that there is only one God. And so Elagabalus begins to try to convince individuals to let go of that great pantheon and to bring their worship, to bring their praise to one God, namely Amasa, namely that sun god. Now, while many people did begin to follow this view, because the emperor's faith is one that many people are going to follow, the fact is that there were many who simply did not, and the old ways of paganism continued on. Judaism was found within the empire. Christianity was found within the empire as well. And so you have this big mix that's taking place. But Elagabalus is responsible for really starting the people of the Roman Empire to think in the way of there being one God as opposed to many. So in many ways, he is kind of paving the way for the concept of Christianity to dominate. Now, at the end of the end of the 200s, the beginning of the 300s, we're going to get another emperor that comes to the throne, one that becomes very famous, and that is Constantine. Constantine is going to be responsible for legalizing and regulating Christianity. The way this comes around, according to the stories and legends, is that Constantine is about to go into battle one day, and he's up against some very difficult odds. But the night before this battle, he sees this vision in the sky of the Chi Rho. The Chi Rho is one of the early symbols of Christianity, made up of the Greek letters Chi and Rho, which are the first letters in the name of Christ. You still see that symbol on Greek Orthodox churches today. He orders, based upon that his soldiers paint this symbol on their shields and go into battle under this Christian symbol. They do so, and they win a tremendous victory. And so at that point, individuals then say, well, maybe it is this Christian God who gave Constantine that great victory. Constantine himself supposedly begins to think in this way. And there are different historians who have came to different conclusions with regards to this, but many people have argued that Constantine at that point simply wanted to become Christian because he saw the victory that he was given by this Christian God. But Christianity was illegal within the empire. What could he do? Well, in the year 313, he enacts what's known as the Edict of Milan, which is one of the first codes of tolerance to be established. This does not make Christianity the official religion of the empire. It doesn't directly push or promote it, but it does establish a basic code of tolerance towards religious beliefs so that anyone from any faith could practice their faith openly without fear of persecution. And that is actually very important because in those early stages, Christianity was an underground movement. Those who came forward ended up being persecuted, and so it was kept as an underground movement. Now, for the first time, they could come out into the open. They could hold open meetings. They could recruit individuals for their cause in a less underhanded manner and without putting their lives at risk to be able to do so. And so this is going to help with the spread of Christianity. Now, as far as Constantine is concerned, some people believe that shortly after the Edict of Milan, Constantine converted to Christianity. There are other historians who believe he doesn't convert until his deathbed, and some believe that he never actually converted. So we don't know for sure, but Constantine is still essentially given the credit for the promotion of Christianity, for bringing it out into the public and giving it the opportunity to grow openly, to grow freely. Now, regardless of whether Constantine himself becomes a Christian or not, one of the things behind his motivation here is his recognition that the Roman Empire was facing problems. When you have all of these competing views, there's violence that many times ensues. And so he said, maybe I can use Christianity as a tool of uniting together the empire. I mean, that empire is so vast. You have people from Africa, you have people from Europe, you have people from the Middle East, from Asia to some extent. All of them coming together with their own beliefs into this massive melting pot, it produces problems. And so Constantine wanted one thing that could unite his kingdom, his empire. And he thought Christianity could be that. But he discovered very quickly that that was not going to be the case. Since Christianity had been hidden away for so long, there was no unified set of beliefs. Some groups of Christians believed that Christ was God himself. Some people believed that Christ was the Son of God. Some individuals believed that he was merely a human teacher who was touched by God. Some individuals believed in the concept of the Trinity, others did not. There was a lot of discrepancy, largely because there was no unified, established body. There was nothing to keep the empire of Christianity together. Once Constantine recognizes this, he says something has to be done. And so he calls what's known as the Council of Nicaea in 325. And he charges this council with establishing the basic tenets, the basic code of what Christianity is going to be. Now, if you read Dan Brown's books and things of that nature, you can sometimes get the impression that Constantine single-handedly created Christianity at that moment. That's not the case. Constantine actually had very little to do with it. He convened it, brought together these leading religious leaders from Christianity from throughout the empire, and he simply opened this meeting and charged them with the task of establishing a basic set order for what Christianity was going to be. And then he leaves it to their devices. It's up to these individuals to argue their points, to debate, and in the end, to come up with a set code, something that the average person could simply memorize and recite. And so the end result of the Council of Nicaea is going to be the Nicenian Code, which establishes things such as the concept of the Trinity. It establishes the idea of Christ as being the second part of that Trinity, being the Son of God, and so on. These basic rules are put into place, and they're put in place in such a way, again, that the average person could simply, if they were asked, what does it mean to be a Christian? You could simply recite those words that you have memorized, and everyone would understand what it is that you believe, what it is that you stand for. The Council of Nicaea is actually a very interesting event in its own right. And one of the major hotbed issues there was this question of the Trinity, because in the Bible, the Trinity is nowhere directly mentioned. It's alluded to in several places. You can see elements in the book of Luke, you can see elements of it in John, and so on, but it's never directly stated. And so it becomes a very, very much a hotbed issue. Part of the problem is that when you think about the idea of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, there are many individuals who would say that these are three separate entities, three separate gods. And that would go against the idea of monotheism. Whereas others will say, no, they are three aspects of the same being or the same entity. They are all one, and so the tradition is monotheistic. Well, during this meeting, Bishop Nicholas is present. Bishop Nicholas, who goes on to become Saint Nicholas, who becomes our founding figure for Christianity, the figure of Santa Claus. He is there, and he very firmly believes in the concept of the Trinity. We are told that during this time, he gets into a very heated debate with another monk there, another priest, and it comes to blows. And our great patron saint, our image of Santa Claus, takes his crozier, his bishop's staff, and he whacks this other guy over the head. Well, that's about the worst crime that you can commit, and so he is derobed of all of his vestments. He is locked away in jail, locked away in prison, and facing punishment for this terrible deed. Overnight, something happens, we don't know what, but when the guards come to check on him the next morning, he is standing completely dressed in all of his vestments and all of his robes, his mitres cap on his head, his bishop's staff in his hands, and there is an eminence of glow all around him. They recognize that this clearly is something that could not have happened through human endeavors. This must have been the work of God, which means that Nicholas's view must be the right view. And so that day, the concept of the Trinity was established, was put into place at the Council of Nicaea. So, again, how much of that story you want to believe, what is allegory written many years after the fact, but it's an interesting take, it's an interesting story anyway to help us understand how the concept of the Trinity becomes such an important part of this tradition. Well, once that view is established, now there is an orthodox view of Christianity. Here is what Christians are expected to believe. But there are going to be others who are not going to be willing to accept that. Those people are going to be labeled heretics. Those people are going to be persecuted. And so in the sad tradition of humanity, we have once again a group of people who were once the persecuted, now becoming the persecutor. They are the ones who were previously hunted down for their beliefs. Now they've got the established view. We're going to hunt down anybody who thinks and acts differently than we do. Finally, in the year 392, the Emperor Theodosius is going to make the declaration that Christianity is the official religion of the Roman Empire. The official religion, which means that your tax money, whether you go to this church or not, whether you believe in its tenets or not, your tax money is going to support the establishment and the upkeep of this faith, and you are expected to celebrate its holidays, you are expected to follow its values, to at least pay lip service to its tenets and its beliefs. Well, again, while this united much of the empire together, it also led to a number of problems. Most notably, those adhering to the old pagan ways were very disgruntled by this. And so when the so-called northern barbarians, those coming in from the Germanic lands, raiding parties and whatnot, they're going to find help amongst those people. And so the seeds of discord are going to be sown. And this is ultimately going to lead to the collapse of the Roman Empire. The empire collapses officially in the year 526 AD. In the year 410, Alaric, one of the Visigoths, is going to actually make it into the city of Rome and sack the city of Rome itself. And in 476, Attila the Hun is going to cross into the Roman territories, do a tremendous amount of damage and difficulty, again, egged on by many of those pagan worshippers who had wanted to promote and support their way of life. So this transition is not the smooth transition that Constantine had hoped for. It's not the uniting effect that it had hoped for. But what it led to was ultimately the breakdown, the disintegration, the destruction of this vast and mighty empire. So I wanted to speak briefly about Augustine, who again would later become Saint Augustine, who lives from 354 to 438. Augustine is one of the great philosophers and theologians of the latter part of the ancient world, sort of the very beginnings of the medieval world. And we find in Augustine that we have a very interesting character. This is someone that writes what is probably the first actual autobiography in the world, a book called The Confessions. And in it, he talks about how he was born in northern Africa to a father who was a pagan and a mother who was a Christian, how he experimented with all sorts of different faiths during his early life. We find that when he goes off to school, that while he is a brilliant individual, while he's able to use his mind to great things, he's somebody who really has to be pushed into that point, because he is much more interested in having a good time in his youth. Augustine is going to become involved in prostitution. He will become involved in drugs. He will become involved in alcohol. He'll become involved in gambling. This is a guy who ultimately is going to be labeled a saint, but yet in his early life, he was doing every corrupt thing imaginable. But one day, he receives this divine message. And the way this happens is that an individual kind of gets struck with an idea, and they go over and they open this book and randomly put their hand down on a particular passage. That passage is supposed to be a message from God. And so Augustine does this, and he reads that message, and it basically tells him that he needs to straighten out his life, that he needs to apply himself. And so he begins to put away the women and the wine and the happy mushrooms and all of that sort of thing. He actually says at one point, one of his most famous phrases, he says, "God grant me chastity, but not yet." So women are going to be the last thing to go. But in any event, he does put his life in order. He does apply himself. And when he does, he is absolutely brilliant. We have more surviving writings from Augustine than we do anyone else prior to the invention of the printing press. So it's amazing the amount of work that he does. Now, one of the most important works that he leaves us is a work called The City of God. The City of God is in many ways sort of a Christian version of Plato's Republic. When you look at Plato, remember we have his division of the realm of being and the realm of becoming. The realm of being perfect and absolute and unchanging. The realm of becoming being our world of change and flux. Well, in Augustine's view, he has the city of God, which he calls Jerusalem, and the city of man, which he calls Babylon. The city of God is described exactly as the realm of being is, perfect, eternal, unchanging, absolute. And the city of man is described in the same way that the realm of becoming is, as alterable, changing, subject to entropy, flux, all of these things. Now, just as Plato taught that we should do everything we can to get as close to that level of perfection, even though we know we can't ultimately attain it in this lifetime, we should work very hard to get as close to it as we possibly can. And that's a good thing. But we can never actually make that transition because we are temporal, finite beings. We can't make that leap into the eternal on our own. But we should try to make this world as close to the world of God as we can. But ultimately, our desire is to escape beyond this world, to make our way into the realm of God. The problem is, he says, that we are not worthy. Our greatest joy, the thing we seek most, is to stand in the face of God and to look into the face of God. But we're unworthy of that because of original sin, because of the fall of Adam. All individuals are unworthy of this. We should all be condemned. We should all be damned because of the fall of Adam. And this is a terrible thing because it would mean that we're not worthy of seeing the face of God. We're not worthy of that ultimate happiness. We're not worthy of living in the kingdom of God. But we are blessed because God has granted us grace, the birth, death, and resurrection of Christ allows for grace. Grace is that ability to override and conquer sin. And so we have that capacity then to be able to override and conquer sin. So we can wash away that sin. We can remain pure. And if we remain pure when we die, we can enter into the city of God. And we can see the face of God and find that ultimate joy and happiness. But here's the problem. Each one of us will be offered grace at some point in our life. It is to be our choice whether we accept it or not. And so we as human beings possess free will. Free will is that ability to make a choice, to make a decision for ourselves. But within Christianity, there is the basic belief that God has absolute knowledge of all things, past, present, and future. God has foreknowledge. And so this brings us to a big philosophical dilemma. How is it possible for us to have free will, the ability to make our own choices, when God has absolute knowledge of all things, when God has foreknowledge? That means that God already knows what choice we're going to make. So how is it a free choice? Think of it this way. If we have a timeline, and here is God back here at the beginning, he's creating the universe. At that point, before anything is ever brought into existence, God knows everything that's going to happen, everything that will ever be, every choice that's ever going to be made. Augustine only lives from 354 to 438. It's during those few brief years that he is able to make choices, to make decisions. Now, when he is offered grace, he should have the freedom to say, yes, I accept it, or no, I reject it. But if God has known long before he was ever born that his answer is yes, then is there any conceivable way that he could say no? Doesn't seem possible. Because if Augustine says no using his free will, then that means God was wrong. And if God can't be wrong and God knows that he said yes, then he has no choice but to say yes. And so it seems that we cannot have both free will and God's foreknowledge at the same time. Augustine is going to wrestle with this issue. Boethius in Book 5 of the Consolation is going to wrestle with this issue. Many other people are going to as well. Augustine's solution is to say that, well, God sees what choice is being made in the future, but he doesn't force it. In other words, it's sort of like God is sitting there looking into a crystal ball and perceiving what's happening in the future. And so Augustine is up there somewhere in the future. He's being presented with this option. He's making this choice. And it is a free choice in that moment. But long before that happened, long before he was ever born, back in the very beginning, here is God gazing into his crystal ball and watching him do this. That's the solution that Augustine essentially tries to give. Boethius is not going to find it all that convincing, and he will have, I think, a much better way of dealing with this problem. But in essence, I wanted you to be familiar with Augustine's view, at least a little bit, so that you understand where Boethius is coming from, because he is going to be initially rejecting Augustine's view, trying to show us what's wrong with it, and then from there, he'll go on and give us his own take on this particular issue. All right? So this should put us in a reasonable place to be able to pick up in the next lecture to talk about Boethius.